Abimi Connor, 28, tattoo artist, got my own chair at a decent shop downtown. Been doing this for about 5 years, built up a solid client base. Not some Instagram famous guy with a waiting list, just consistent work, steady money, repeat customers who actually trust me. Decent apartment, decent life, nothing glamorous. The shop is a real place, not some trendy studio with neon signs and curated playlists. Just a clean space with good lighting, experienced people, and a reputation for doing things right. I got in because one of the senior guys gave me a shot after seeing my sketchbooks. Worked my way up, simple as that. Been with Brittany for about 1.5 years at this point. She's a fitness coach, does online stuff mostly, has a following she talks about way too much. Posts about empowerment constantly. Toxic masculinity this, internalized misogyny that. When we first started dating, I thought it was just something she was into, like how some people are really into true crime podcasts. Background noise, not the main frequency of the person. Turns out it was more the main frequency than I'd understood. She'd frame everything through it eventually. Conversations about movies, about people we knew, about things that happened to me at work. I'd tell her about a client who'd been difficult, and somehow it became a discussion about systemic male entitlement. I genuinely have no idea how we got there from me describing a guy who couldn't sit still. I never really engaged with any of it, just kind of existed next to it. She'd show me something on her phone sometimes, like look at this, and I'd go, yeah, and go back to whatever I was doing. She seemed fine with that arrangement for a long time, or I thought she was fine with it. We had our routine, her place on weekends mostly, occasionally mine. She'd cook sometimes, and I'd clean up after. We'd watch things. We'd go places on Sundays. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable, and I valued stable. Things weren't perfect, but they weren't bad either, or so I thought. The issue was always kind of under the surface, these little comments she'd make, like I'd tell a story about a client, and she'd find a way to make it about patriarchal structures or whatever. I'd just nod and finish my food. There was this thing she did where she'd describe men in general, as being a certain way, and I'd be sitting right there, a man, apparently not included in that category in her mind, or maybe very much included, hard to tell. I never challenged it. Looking back, I probably should have said something earlier, drawn some kind of line. But I kept thinking it wasn't that serious. People have their things. She wasn't hurting anyone. Looking back, there were signs the whole arrangement was changing. She started listening to some podcast. I don't know which one. Some women's liberation type thing. She'd have it on while she was getting ready in the mornings, and I'd hear fragments through the bathroom door. A lot of language about authenticity and not dimming your light and questioning the structures that have been imposed on you. Started having these long phone calls with her friend, her best friend, a girl she'd known since college. I could hear bits of the conversations through the wall sometimes. Words like liberation and authentic self kept coming up. Her friend had apparently made some major change in her own life recently, and Brittany kept referencing it like a case study. Didn't think much of it at the time. I was busy with work. We had some big projects going at the shop. I was focused on that. Had this one piece I'd been planning for months, a full back piece for a client who trusted me with a really personal design. Takes a lot of your mental bandwidth when you're doing something that scale. So, I wasn't paying close attention to the shift happening at home. Then, one Sunday evening, it happened. She came back from seeing her friend. I was on the couch watching something. She sat down across from me, not next to me, across from me, like she was about to do a performance review. Put her phone face down on the table. The face down thing was unusual. She always has her phone face up. Told me she'd been reading about ethical non-monogamy. Said she thought it could be good for both of us. Said it was about freedom and personal growth. Said it didn't mean she loved me any less. Said the two things weren't mutually exclusive. I remember just looking at her for a few seconds. She had this expression like she was waiting for me to argue, to beg, to do something dramatic, like she'd rehearsed how she was going to handle my reaction. I said, "Okay." She blinked. Said, "What do you mean, okay?" I said, "I mean, okay, got it. I heard you." She said, "That's it. You're just going to say, okay." I said, "What else would you like me to say?" She said, "I thought we'd talk about it." I said, "You presented it as a thing you'd decided, not as something you wanted to discuss." She started saying something about how that wasn't exactly how it was. I stood up, went to the bedroom, grabbed my jacket and the bag I keep at her place. She followed me to the doorway and said, "Aren't you going to say anything else?" I said, "I think you said the important things already." She said she didn't mean it like this, didn't mean for me to just leave. I said, "I know, but I'm going to anyway." Walked out, took the stairs, because I didn't want to stand in the elevator. Called my buddy Jake on the way down the street, just asked if I could crash for a night or two. He said, "Yeah, obviously. Come over, we'll figure it out." Didn't explain much on the phone, just said things with Brittany were done. He didn't push it, didn't ask 20 questions, just said come over and gave me the address like I hadn't been there 100 times, which is why Jake is a good friend. Got to his place, he made food, we sat in the kitchen. He's a good cook. Nothing fancy, just solid, reliable food. I told him what happened. He just kind of sat there for a second, processing it, then said, "That's wild, man. That's a choice she made." Didn't try to fix it or tell me how to feel about it. Just acknowledged that it was a bizarre thing to have happened to you on a Sunday evening. We ate, and he said, "Hey, by the way, Lily's coming over later. We were gonna watch something. That okay?" I said, "Sure." I wasn't planning on going anywhere. I'd met Lily a couple times before at Jake's gatherings. She's his friend from way back, used to work with him at some previous job. We'd said maybe 10 words to each other total across those times. She'd seemed fine in the brief moments I'd registered her, just not someone I'd thought much about. She showed up later that evening, said hey to me like it was completely normal that I was there with a bag. Didn't ask why, didn't make a face, just incorporated me into the evening without comment, which I appreciated more than I would have expected to. We watched whatever was on. I genuinely don't remember what it was. Some action thing Jake had been wanting to see. But at some point Lily made this comment about a scene, just under her breath, not to anyone in particular. And it was actually funny. Like genuinely sharp, not trying to be funny, just a dry observation about the logic of what was happening on screen. I laughed, and she glanced over like she didn't quite expect that reaction from me. We ended up talking a bit after the movie, mostly me and her, while Jake was in the kitchen doing something. Nothing heavy, just regular conversation about nothing important. She's easy to talk to in a way that's hard to describe exactly. Just no friction. I remember thinking it was the most relaxed I'd felt all evening, which had been a pretty strange evening. Went to bed on Jake's couch, feeling weird, but not destroyed. Couldn't sleep for a while, just stared at the ceiling. Wasn't feeling heartbreak exactly. More like that slightly surreal feeling when something you thought was one thing turns out to have been something else. Like the ground shifted and you're recalibrating your footing. Eventually fell asleep. Woke up the next morning to a message from Brittany. Just said, "Are you coming back today?" I read it and set the phone down on the coffee table. Went to Jake's bathroom, got ready, ate whatever was in his kitchen that seemed reasonable. Went to work. The shop is about a 10-minute walk from Jake's place, which worked out fine. Had a full day of appointments, so I just focused on that. There's something about tattooing that requires your full presence in a way that's actually useful sometimes. You can't drift off thinking about other things. You're working on someone's skin. You have to be there. So, for 8 hours, I was just there, in the work. Around lunch, I walked across the street to get coffee. There's this small place that's been there since before the shop opened, One of those spots that somehow survives every wave of new places opening and closing around it. I go maybe 3 or 4 times a week. The coffee is good and it's not loud. Walked in and there was a girl sitting by the window with a book. She looked up when the door opened because of the bell above the door. I didn't recognize her. She wasn't a regular as far as I could tell. I ordered and was waiting by the counter, and she looked over again and said, "Hey, are those sleeves yours? Did you do them?" I said most of them. Yeah, different periods of time. She said she could tell the style was consistent, even though the imagery was different. I asked what she meant, and she actually explained it in a specific way. Not just a generic compliment, she'd noticed something real about the way the line work connected across different pieces. Said it felt like it was made by one sensibility, even when the subjects changed. That's not how most people talk about tattoos when they're trying to start a conversation. Turns out she'd been thinking about getting something done and had spent some time researching different artists and styles. We talked for maybe 15 or 20 minutes while I waited for my order and then drank my coffee. She was easy to talk to, asked questions that showed she'd actually thought about the topic. No questions about pain or about what my parents thought or whatever. She was curious about the craft. At some point, I realized I was going to be late getting back to my client. Before I left, she said she was in there most days if I ever wanted to continue the conversation. Not a move exactly. At least it didn't feel like one. Just a statement of availability. I said cool and went back across the street. Spent the rest of the afternoon focused on work. That evening, Brittany called. I picked up because I figured we'd have to talk eventually. She said she hadn't expected me to just leave like that. She thought we'd talk about it together. I said we did talk about it. You told me what you wanted, and I heard you and responded. She said, but that's not how it was supposed to go. I asked how it was supposed to go. She went quiet for a second, like she hadn't quite prepared for that question. She said she thought we'd discuss it, negotiate, figure out something together. I said you came home having already decided something. That doesn't leave a lot of room for negotiation. She said she just wanted more freedom, that it wasn't about me specifically. It was about her growth. I said I understand. I'm not stopping you from growing. She said that's not the point. I said okay, but I think we're done then. She said I didn't say that. I said I know, I'm saying it. She didn't have a response to that immediately. I told her I'd figure out getting the rest of my stuff at some point, and we'd keep it clean. She said she didn't want it to be like this. I said I know, me neither, but here we are. Hung up. Jake was in the other room, had obviously heard some of it, pretended not to. He just came to the kitchen doorway and said, "You want a beer?" And I said, "Yeah." We watched something else that evening. Didn't talk about Brittany at all, which was the right call. Jake's good at reading when someone wants to process out loud versus when they just want to exist somewhere. Lily texted Jake that evening about something unrelated, and they went back and forth a bit. At some point he mentioned I was still there, and she responded. He accidentally forwarded her response to me instead of to himself. Must have hit the wrong name. It said something like, "Connor seems like a solid guy. Hope he's all right." I just sent back a thumbs up and didn't make it weird. He sent a follow-up message that said, "Sorry, wrong person," and I sent back no worries. Went to sleep on the couch again. Next day at the shop was another full schedule. I was doing a session on that big back piece I mentioned. Hours of work. The client is a guy in his 40s. Been coming to me for about 2 years. We talk a lot during sessions because it helps him sit through the longer ones. We talked about random things, his kids, a trip he was planning. Nothing personal on my end. Just two people having a conversation while one of them happens to be getting tattooed. Lunchtime came around, and without really deciding to, I walked over to the coffee place again. Sophie was there, same table, different book. She looked up when I walked in, recognized me, gave a small nod. I ordered and then asked if I could sit. She said sure, and pushed her bag off the chair across from her. We talked for longer this time, probably close to 40 minutes. I found out what she did, something in logistics, coordinating contracts and shipments for a company that imports things. She explained it clearly, without making it sound more exciting than it was, which I appreciated. Some people make their job sound either incredibly glamorous or impossibly tedious. She just described what it actually was. She asked about tattooing in a way that was different from the usual questions. Wanted to know about the actual technical process, the machines, the difference between styles in terms of skill level and what they actually require. Not what it's like to be a tattooed person in the world, the craft itself. I told her about rotary versus coil machines, about the difference between bold, traditional work and fine line stuff in terms of technique, about what fades well and what doesn't, what requires a steadier hand, what requires more planning. She listened the way people listen when they're actually interested versus when they're waiting for their turn to speak. At some point, I mentioned I had to get back, and she closed her book. Before I left, I asked for her number. She gave it to me without any kind of hesitation or performance around it, just pulled out her phone and handed it over. I put my number in and handed it back. Texted her that evening, something small referencing a thing we'd talked about, one of the technical points about how certain pigments hold differently in different skin types. She responded within a few minutes, and we went back and forth for a while. Not intense, just easy. Like the conversation at the coffee place had just continued. That same night, Brittany sent a long message. I read the whole thing. The gist was that she'd been thinking, and maybe things had moved too fast, and she thought the open relationship idea could work if they approached it the right way, with the right agreements and boundaries. There was a lot of language in there about mutual respect and both people having equal freedom. I didn't respond that night. Lay there on Jake's couch thinking about it. Not about whether to go back. I wasn't considering that. More about the architecture of how she'd thought about the whole thing, like she'd imagined a version of events where she announced something significant, and I stayed in the picture and just adjusted to it. And when I didn't, that was the surprising part to her. Fell asleep. Next day at work, one of the guys at the shop, the one who handles scheduling and the front desk, mentioned that a girl had called asking for me. Described the voice and the name, and it was Brittany. I said if she calls again, just tell her I'm booked, which wasn't untrue. He gave me a look, but let it go. After work, I texted Sophie and asked if she wanted to walk somewhere. She suggested a route she knew along the water. We met up near there and just walked. She knew the area well, pointed out things without making it a tour, just mentioning things in passing. We got food from a cart at some point and stood around eating it by the water while it was still light out. Nothing dramatic, just a good evening. She didn't ask about my situation, and I didn't bring it up. We talked about things she'd seen lately, a documentary she'd found interesting, a book she thought was overhyped. She has opinions and doesn't apologize for them, which I find easier to be around than people who constantly hedge everything. We walked back toward the main street and said we'd do it again. Both of us meant it. You can usually tell when someone means something like that versus when it's social filler. Couple more days passed. I'd been at Jake's the whole time. He said I could stay as long as I needed to get sorted. Lily came over again, and this time we ended up talking more directly. Jake was in and out of the room, so it was mostly her and me for stretches. She's the kind of person who asks questions and actually waits for the full answer before formulating her response. She asked how I was doing with everything, and I said honestly, pretty good considering. She laughed a little and said Jake had told her a bit, that it sounded messy. I said it was actually pretty clean. Brittany made a choice, and I responded to it. No mess, really. She said that's a good way to frame it. I said it's not really framing. It just is what it is. We talked about other things after that, her work, something she was trying to figure out in her own life, nothing I need to go into. At some point, Jake showed us something on his phone. Brittany had posted something, I didn't see exactly what it said, but it was clearly about men and emotional unavailability and women choosing themselves. Comments underneath full of people agreeing and saying things like this: Queen energy. I looked at it for a second and handed the phone back and said good for her. Jake said, "You're not annoyed by that." I said, "Not really. She can post whatever she wants. What am I going to do about it?" He thought about that and said, "Fair point." Lily caught my eye and gave a very small nod like she was filing that away. The situation with Sophie kept developing at its own pace. We kept meeting at the coffee place and occasionally doing other things in the evenings. She came by the shop one afternoon when I had a gap between clients. I showed her around, the different stations, the reference books we keep, the flash designs on the walls. She looked at everything with the same focused attention she brought to the conversation, not casual browsing, actually looking. One of the guys at the shop raised his eyebrows at me when she stepped away to look at something, and I ignored him completely. Around that time, Brittany reached out again. Different message than before, more direct. Said she wanted to meet in person, that she thought they were letting something real fall apart over a misunderstanding. I said I didn't think we were letting anything fall apart. I thought we were both responding sensibly to what she'd said. She said that wasn't what she'd meant. I said, "What did you mean then?" She said she missed me, and that she thought she'd made a mistake, and that she wanted to fix it. I sat with that for a while before responding. Then I said, "I don't think you made a mistake. I think you said something that was true about what you wanted, and I took you at your word." She said she hadn't thought I'd just leave, hadn't thought that would be my response. And there it was, the actual thing. She'd expected me to fight for it, to argue, and be upset, and eventually stay anyway. She'd expected the announcement to be a test of some kind, and my leaving was the wrong answer to the test. I said I do care about you. I cared enough to respect what you said and act on it. She said that wasn't the same thing as caring. I said I know, and I think that difference is exactly the problem, and I don't think talking in person is going to resolve it. She went quiet for a while, then said she thought I was being stubborn and that I was letting my ego make the decision. I said maybe. I don't know, but I don't think so. She said she'd been talking to her friend, and her friend thought I was just afraid of change. I said her friend doesn't know me at all. She said I know, but still. I said I hope you find what you're looking for, Brittany, genuinely. She said that's such a cold thing to say. I said I don't mean it coldly. We didn't talk after that. I found a place a few weeks in. Small studio, 1 room, not far from the shop. Exactly what I needed. Signed the lease and felt the kind of relief that's also a little strange, because you hadn't realized how much you'd been holding. Arranged to collect my things from Brittany's place while she was out. We handled it by message, kept it logistical. No final conversation, no sitting down to have the talk that was supposed to bring closure. Just boxes and a key left on the counter, and done. I don't think I needed a big ending. Some things just stop, and that's enough. The new place took a few weeks to feel like mine. I'm not someone who decorates quickly. I'd rather live with blank walls for a month and figure out what actually belongs there than rush it. Put up a couple things gradually. Got the furniture arranged, bought a decent table. Jake helped me move the bigger stuff and complained about it the entire time in a way that was clearly joking. Lily sent a message the day I moved in that just said, "Congratulations on the new place. Jake mentioned it." I thanked her, and she sent back a series of increasingly specific suggestions for housewarming plants that I didn't ask for, but read every one of. She has a thing about plants, apparently. I bought one of the ones she mentioned, a hardy one that she promised I couldn't kill. Put it near the window, and it seems fine so far. Sophie came over when I got the keys to help figure out the furniture. She has strong opinions about spatial arrangement, which I found out is actually incredibly useful when you're standing in an empty room holding instructions to a flat-pack bookshelf. She moved around the space, pointing at where things should go and explaining the reasoning. It made sense. We set things up. She helped with some of the assembly. At some point, we ordered food because neither of us had eaten. Ate on the floor because the table wasn't up yet. The kind of evening that sounds like nothing but felt like something. Work kept being good. Had a stretch of really satisfying projects, the kind where the client trusts you completely and you can just make the right decisions without having to justify every line. My regular with the back piece came in for another session, and we were getting close to the end of it. He looked at the progress in the mirror and got quiet, in the way people sometimes do when they see something they've been waiting for coming together. Those moments are why I do the work. The meme exchange with Lily became a consistent thing. She'd send something, and I'd respond, and it would go back and forth for a bit. Completely low stakes, no subtext to it, just two people who found each other funny. Jake mentioned it once, said Lily was happy I was doing well. I said tell her thanks. He said you could tell her yourself. I said I know. I'm telling her through you right now. He shook his head, but was smiling. Heard through Jake at some point that Brittany had put up another post, something about men who can't handle a woman who knows her worth. He'd seen it come across somewhere and mentioned it briefly. I said I hope she's okay. He said you mean that? I said yeah. I don't have anything against her. The situation just didn't work. He said you're a weirdly calm person sometimes, you know that. I said I'll take it. Sophie and I had settled into something by then. Not labeled, not announced, just consistent. She'd come by the shop occasionally. I'd come to her neighborhood sometimes. We'd text in the evenings, nothing heavy, just the continuation of a conversation that had started in a coffee shop. One evening I was working late on a design for a client. Had the music going. The place was quiet. She sent a photo of something she was reading with a comment about it. I replied, and it turned into a back and forth that went for a couple of hours while I worked. She didn't mind that my responses were occasionally slow because I was focused on the drawing. Some people need constant response time. Treat a delay as a signal of something. She just continued when I came back. No comment about it. Found that out early and filed it away as a good sign. The weeks kept moving. The back piece got finished on a Tuesday afternoon. Client came in. We did the final session, about 3 hours. When it was done and wrapped and he'd had a chance to see it properly, he shook my hand for a long time without saying anything. Then he said thank you in a way that meant more than 2 words usually mean. I said thank you for trusting me with it. He said you made the right calls every time. I never had to second guess. Went home that evening feeling good in a simple, uncomplicated way. Sophie came over for dinner. I cooked something I actually know how to make without consulting anything. We ate at the table, which was set up properly now, chairs and everything. She'd brought that framed print a few visits earlier, and it was on the wall above the couch. She'd asked before she even got it out of the bag whether I wanted it there or if it was too much. I'd said let me see it and looked at it and said yeah, that works. It did work. We talked about her week, about a work thing that had been annoying her, about something she wanted to do later in the year. Normal conversation, no performance to it. After dinner, she was looking at the plant in the window, the one from Lily's list. Said it looked healthy. I said it's apparently impossible to kill. Lily's orders. Sophie said Lily has good taste in plants. I said apparently. She asked who Lily was, and I explained. Jake's friend. We'd been texting occasionally. She said that's good. Sounds like a good person. No weirdness to it. No subtext. Just a normal response. Which sounds like nothing, but it's actually something. Went on. Started doing some designs in the evenings that were more for me than for clients. Just exploring. Trying things I hadn't tried before. Good creative period. The kind that happens when the rest of your life is stable enough that you can actually concentrate on the work. Jake came over one evening and looked at some of the drawings spread on the table. Said you should do a show sometime. I said maybe eventually. He said no, seriously, these are good. I said I know. I'm not disagreeing, just not in a rush. He laughed and said, "You never are." Lily came over to Jake's place one evening when I happened to be there for the first time in a while. We talked for a couple of hours, mostly her and me with Jake drifting in and out. She's working on something creative herself. She doesn't want to talk about it in detail yet, because she gets superstitious about it. But she mentioned it. I said, "I get that." She said, "You seem like the type who gets that." I said, "What type is that?" She said, "The type who knows when to keep something close until it's ready." Fair enough. Life in the new place kept getting more settled. Had a routine for the mornings. Coffee from the place near the shop. Walk in, set up. Evenings were varied. Sometimes Sophie, sometimes on my own, working on the drawings. Occasional thing with Jake. Nothing dramatic. Not a single Sunday that felt like the Sunday when Brittany sat across from me with her phone face down. Different category of days entirely. One morning, I was at the coffee place, sitting at the window, the one Sophie and I had first talked at, without knowing that's what it would become. Early enough that it was quiet in there. Had my coffee, wasn't thinking about anything in particular. Sophie sent a message. Photo of a book she'd found at some weekend market. Caption said, "You'd hate this. Read it." I actually laughed out loud, alone, which I almost never do. Wrote back asking what specifically about it she thought I'd hate. She sent back a 3-sentence breakdown that was entirely accurate, based on things she knew about my taste. I said she was right, and she responded with, "I know," very simply. Put the phone down on the table. Finished the coffee looking out at the street. Had a full schedule that day. A client coming in for the start of a new project. Big piece. Going to take months. Always a good feeling at the beginning of something like that. The planning stage. The potential of it. Went back across the street to the shop. New client was already waiting. Showed up early, which I like. He'd brought a folder of reference images. Serious about what he wanted. Had clearly done his research. We sat down and went through it. I asked questions. He answered clearly. By the end of the consultation, we had a direction, and I was already thinking about how to approach it. Shook hands, and he left. I had maybe 20 minutes before the next person. Sat at my station and did some rough sketching while it was still fresh. One of the other artists wandered over and looked at what I was doing. Asked about the new piece, and I explained the concept. He said that's going to be good. I said, "Yeah, I think so." Went back to the sketching. At the end of the day, I was the last one locking up. Walked home through the part of the neighborhood that takes a bit longer, but feels better. The kind of walk where you're not going anywhere urgent and can just be outside. Past the coffee place, closed by then, lights off. Past a few spots I'd been going to long enough that the people inside nodded through the glass. Got home, made food, put something on in the background. Nothing specific, just noise that makes a quiet apartment feel less quiet. Didn't need it as much as I'd thought I would. Living alone after years of shared spaces and someone else's routines is an adjustment, but not a bad one. You find out quickly what's actually yours versus what was just the shape of the other person's habits. I cook differently when it's just me, eat at different times, stay up later, or go to sleep earlier depending on what I'm doing. The drawings I was working on in the evenings had started to feel like something specific. A series, maybe, loosely connected. I hadn't told many people about it, just Jake when he came over and saw them spread on the table. Sophie had seen some of them too. She'd picked one up and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then said, "Where is this one going?" I said, "I don't know yet." She put it back carefully and said, "I think you'll figure it out." That was the right thing to say. Some people feel the need to evaluate immediately, to tell you what they think it means or where you should take it. She just said she thought I'd figure it out. A few weeks after that, Sophie came over on a night when I was in the middle of working on one of the drawings. I'd said come over whenever, and she'd taken that literally. She let herself in with the key I'd given her, came to where I was working, looked over my shoulder for a second without interrupting, then went to the kitchen and made tea, and came back and sat on the couch nearby with a book. We were in the same room doing separate things for a couple of hours. I finished the drawing I was working on, and she looked up when I put the pen down, asked if I wanted to look at it together or if I was done for the night. I said, let's look at it. We spread the paper on the table, and she looked at it properly. She said it fits with the others. It has the same feeling, but it's the most complete one so far. I said that's what I was going for. She said, you got it. We ate something after that, late, nothing complicated, stood in the kitchen talking about other things. Before she left, she looked at the plant in the window again. It had grown noticeably, putting out new leaves. She said that plant is really thriving. I said it's a good plant. She said it is, left. I stood in the apartment for a minute after the door closed. Not sad, not nostalgic, just present. Everything in the room was there because I'd put it there. The drawings on the table, the plant by the window, the framed thing on the wall. The apartment felt like mine in a way that was simple and complete. Went to bed, woke up the next day, and went back to the shop. That was it. No big ending to report. Nothing clicked into place in some dramatic way. The Sunday when Brittany sat down across from me and put her phone face down, that was the last time anything felt like it was being declared at me. Everything since then has just been regular. Regular is better than I gave it credit for. A Tuesday with good coffee and a full schedule and a message that makes you laugh. That's the thing, actually. That's what good looks like when you're not distracted by all the noise.